Fantastic to have you all along tonight. Well, I'm personally very excited to be hosting today with really someone that has such a large knowledge and is the key creator and the lead author of the Teaching and Learning Toolkit here tonight. So very happy to have Steve joining us. Where are you joining us from, Steve?
I'm at Durham University, Durham in northeast England.
Oh, fantastic, Steve. And I'm actually in somewhere a bit different too. I'm in Queensland today, and then we have another team member. We have Susanna Schofield as well on the chat box tonight in Melbourne. So we're spread all over the place, and Meg as well joining me in Queensland. So we'll get started as we always do, and we'll start off by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Turrbal people tonight, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So what we thought we'd start off tonight with, which is a little bit different, we're going to start off with a walkthrough of the toolkits, both the toolkits. Just today we've released the Early Education Toolkit. Now, Steve and his team leads up all the research behind these first toolkits, but I thought it would be good just to start off with a little refresher and a little walkthrough of the site. Now, what I would love you all to do now within the chat box is just to let us know where you're joining us from tonight, and also let us know your role. That would be fantastic, and that way we'll have a little bit more of an idea of who is joining us in the room. All right, fantastic. So if we jump onto the site, here we are here, and if I jump onto the toolkits now, you can see that we've got our Early Childhood Education released as of today, and we've got the Teaching and Learning Toolkit as well. I'm going to walk you through the Early Childhood Education Toolkit today, just because it has just been released and it has the similar frame that Steve has produced with Education Endowment Foundation as well. So what we have here is our average cost, and that's per every 25 children, the average cost spread across them, and then we have our evidence security and their months of impact. And tonight we've got some great questions really, where we'll be delving into a lot of depths around how exactly is that months of impact calculated, what are the calculations that Steve has used, and we'll be exploring effect sizes in detail as well with some of the fantastic questions that you've sent through for us here tonight. So if we just have a look at one of the approaches, you can see we've got the headline figures of what is it, how effective is it, how secure is the evidence, what are the costs, what should I consider, and the references. To me, the what should I consider is that really practical, more practical part about turning evidence more into what it is in practice within the classroom. And then we have the references. This to me is the heart and soul of the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which all comes out of the Durham University and the team that Steve leads up there. We've got there the months of impact, and that's translated from here, our mean weighted effect size, which we'll be going through. Steve will be walking us through exactly how that is done today. What we also have on our site, which makes it unique, is that we also have our Australasian research summaries. These are distinct in their evidence base in comparison to the toolkits. They involve both qualitative and quantitative research, and they just produce a research summary of 500 words looking at the past 6 years in Australia and New Zealand, in really contextualising what that research means within an Australian setting. And you can see here we've collaborated with Telethon Kids Institute in bringing this research to you all across Australia. All right, we're going to jump back now, and we'll jump back into the presentation. Oh, fantastic. Great to have people joining us from all across Australia. Oh, Phillip Island. Great. Sorry, I get a bit distracted by the chat box, Steve, so we'll interject. It'll be a bit of back and forth with me. And there's a preschool teacher. Oh, fantastic. Great to have you here. You're going to, hopefully you love our Early Education Toolkit released today. Maths in Wollongong, thank you. And Janelle from Adelaide Independence. So it's great. We've got quite a range of people joining us here tonight. We've got Deputy Principal. Oh, fantastic. Great. We've got some from policy bodies as well, from organisations across Australia. Oh, we've got someone from the EF joining us too tonight. Thanks for joining us, Amy. Fantastic. So we have got an amazing audience with us tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. So now we've just had a walk through the toolkit, and I'll let Steve give a bit of background now with his slides in telling us a little bit about the creation of the toolkit. Handing over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Yes, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time explaining how the toolkit was created and the context in which it emerged in England. One of the things that's been a real both surprise but also a delight is that we've found that the toolkit's useful in other parts of the world, and I kind of want to explain a little bit more about where we started from and why it has the shape that it does. I should acknowledge early on that my work with John Hattie about 15 years ago was part of the inspiration for this. And I've always seen him as a pioneer in the field of evidence and education. And as I say, I was lucky enough to work with him about 15 years ago on looking at how we take evidence from meta-analysis and then how we communicate that to teachers and other professionals in education to support decision-making in schools. And I need to emphasize that that's really where I start from. I think the nature of evidence is such that it should never and can never determine what we do in schools. On the other hand, I think it's important to be aware of what the evidence says that then informs our decision making. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We had an interesting context in England where the government wanted to put more money into supporting children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And the government suggested a few things that they thought schools could do, that they thought schools might want to spend this additional money on. And when we looked at that, we realized that actually the resource either wasn't going to be sufficient to achieve the government's aims, or actually the approaches themselves weren't as effective as people believed. Now, my background was as a primary school teacher, and I've always been interested in how we communicate evidence and use evidence from academic journals to support decision-making. I was really frustrated when I first started as an academic in realizing that there was an enormous amount of information that would have helped me when I was in the classroom. So that's been part of my mission, to try and find ways to translate and communicate that to support decision-making. I've been very lucky in that the policy context in the UK meant that the Sutton Trust and then the Education Endowment Foundation have supported my work. And we're at the stage now in England where about 60% of schools report using the toolkit. To be fair, we don't know exactly how they use the toolkit. We don't know how much they use it to justify the decisions they wanted to make anyway. But we certainly know anecdotally from working with schools that they do use it to discuss and think about the nature of the evidence in relation to the context in their school. And that's how I think it's important to use the evidence. Evidence applies from studies in other places with other children. You know what works on average in that study, and then there's a professional responsibility to interpret that and think about whether that's a good solution to a challenge or problem in our school. Could you move on one slide for me? Thank you. The key principles we were trying to get across, and this is where I think we start to build on the work that John started, is I'm interested in the cost-benefit analysis. I want to know not just is something likely to work, but I want to help teachers make decisions about what's likely to be better, one choice better than another choice. And that meant we needed to find a way to put all of the evidence on a single scale, which is why we use effect size. And when I get to the questions in a few minutes, I'll get into more detail of the kind of geeky statistics we need to engage with to understand what effect size means. Where the toolkit differs from visible learning is that we were interested in the process of change. Visible learning is about the general influences on learning. So looking at the whole of research in education and looking at the relationship between the different categories and outcomes for children and young people in schools. What we were interested in doing because of the policy context in the UK was what can schools do additionally to what they're already doing in order to bring about a process of change. So we were interested particularly in experimental designs, where researchers and schools have tried to bring about improvement. How successful have they been? So that's one of the key differences. We tend to use, wherever possible, only the experimental evidence. The reason for that is probably easiest to explain when you look at a subject like, or a topic like homework. So homework's interesting because there's a link between how likely children are to do homework with how well supported they are at home. So if you look at the general effect of homework, you'll see quite a positive link between success at school and homework completion or homework set in schools. But that masks or hides the fact that children with supportive backgrounds, children with parents with higher educational aspirations are more likely to support and encourage their children to do homework. And those children are likely to do better in school anyway. So we don't know what the direct effect of homework is. Whereas if we only look at the intervention studies, where schools or researchers have used homework as a means to bring about improvement, we have a much more precise measurement of the process of change when schools introduce something new. So that's really why we focus on experimental designs. And I'll unpack a few more of those when we come to the questions, because some of those are relevant to the issues that have been raised. We tried where possible to use high quality designs, and that's high quality designs in the sense that you can infer a causal mechanism. Did this change lead to the change in outcomes? Largely because of this problem I've just explained in terms of homework. Now, that's not to say that other education research isn't valuable, and particularly if you want to understand educational processes, or if you want to understand growth and development, say in mathematics or reading, you need different kinds of research. But in terms of the choices schools make about where they put their energy and effort, experimental designs, we think, are the best ones to inform that decision making. As I mentioned, I'll come back to effect size, but we wanted a single scale. We thought that months progress was the most accessible. And although I have my reservations about months progress, and I'll unpack those in a few minutes, I haven't been able to come up with a better way of communicating progress on a single scale. You could use effect size directly, but I think people struggle with what an effect size of 0.25 compared with 0.45 means, whereas months progress gives a better handle. And we essentially needed to make comparisons between different areas of education research. Because again, as an academic, I realized that all academics think their ideas are the best and that their ideas work, and all schools should do what they think works. But schools and teachers need to think about, hang on, how does this work better than this? In what circumstances might this be a good idea? So schools need to make relative judgments, not absolute judgments about whether something's effective or not. So that's why we create this single scale. One of my debates with John over the years has been about absolute measurements, and I'll talk about this more in terms of his hinge effect in a few minutes. But we're also interested in the costs of adopting. Now that's hard to do in schools, because actually schools don't have a lot of control over the costs within a particular budget. Largely, once you've taken care of staffing, that's most of your budget gone. But we are interested in the relative value, the amount of time that you might need to spend on a particular approach to get a particular benefit. And also, I'll go for a really low effect size if it's reliable and cheap or doesn't take much time. So sometimes you may not want to set a very high bar. Actually, if something's easy to achieve but has a relatively small effect, then go for it. So I think that it's important to consider cost benefit. And that's one of the key differences, I think, from our approach to John's invisible learning. Okay, could you move on to the next slide? Okay, there are some, before I move on to some question and answer, there are some other principles I'd like to get across in terms of what I think's important. I mentioned right when I started that I think the toolkit is about supporting professional decision making. There are all kinds of reasons for that, and part of it is undoubtedly my teacher bias. That's still with me even after 20 years in academia. I think teaching is a profession, and it's important to recognize it as such. I think there are technical reasons why that's true. So if you look at the evidence of impact, say an area like phonics, which we may well get some questions about later, if you look at the typical effect sizes, they're about 0.3 to 0.4. So in my language, that's 3 to 5 months improvement. That means that not all of the children in a particular class have done better than the children who were learning with the control mechanism. It's somewhere between 20 to 25% of children will have benefited. That means if you implement an approach that has strong evidence of impact, you have to be aware that not all of the children may necessarily benefit. If you had an effect size of 3.0, then the distributions would actually separate. And at that point, everyone should do it all the time. But actually for smaller effect sizes, there's advantages and disadvantages. What we often forget in education is that the control group don't do nothing. Children tend to improve over time anyway, and we're looking at relative progress. So it's really important to be critical about that. As I say, unless you have an effect size of 3, some of the children in the control group were better off being in the control group. And it's being aware of that, I think, in terms of informing decision making. That's why I like this idea of good bets and risky bets. The higher the effect size, the more likely it is that children in a particular class in a new context are going to benefit. The smaller the effect size, the riskier the bet is. But I think it's also important to use professional judgment, because it may be that a particular approach that on average doesn't work well somewhere else may actually work for you. My advice would be, you need to be really clear with a risky bet as to why you think you'll buck the trend. Why won't you see the average effects? Whereas if you see something that's a good bet, then actually the chances are that on average you are likely to benefit. One of the ironies in evidence-based education is that the more successful the school in terms of their overall learning and achievement, the harder it will be to bring about improvement based on what we know from averages in other places. So if you're already relatively successful in what you're doing, you're going to be looking for marginal gains. You're not going to get huge improvement, even if you use research-based methods, because you're already probably performing above the average of what was the control group in the research. On the other hand, if you're a less successful school and looking to bring about improvement, then there may be things that actually on average don't work for most people. They may still work for you. So we have to think really carefully about the context in which we're trying to apply this. And I think the idea of good bets and risky bets, encouraging schools to justify the decisions they make in those terms, is a really important part of the professional learning process. And just to reinforce that point, research tells you what's worked, past tense, on average, in other places, for other teachers, with other children. It doesn't guarantee what will work for you, but it gives you a good guess, a good bet. And it's that, I think, again, we've got to be really careful about. If the teacher and the school are important components in that process of change. I've always argued that if you give me the best researched phonics intervention in the world, that as a teacher of 6 and 7-year-olds, I could guarantee to make it fail in my classroom if I didn't want it to work. The teacher has to accept responsibility for making it work. None of these programs and approaches work on their own. They don't have agency. It's the teacher and the children in the class who have agency. So it's important, again, to bear that in mind. You can't simply pick something up and expect it to work in your context if it worked somewhere else without that commitment and engagement. Another problem with the toolkits is the more certain we are that something tends to work on average, the less certain we are about what it's better than. Because we know that things work better than what's usual practice. Often in research, that isn't well defined. It's kind of the default in a particular education system. So we know it works better on average than what was in a specific research project, but in meta-analysis, we then combine the effects. What we forget is we also combine the control groups. We average the control groups. So if you have something that's consistently beneficial, so metacognition and self-regulation would be a good example. We know that encouraging children to plan, monitor, and review what they do, to take control of their own motivation, their persistence, their resilience, is a very effective thing to do. But although we're certain that on average that's a good thing to do, we don't actually know precisely what it's better than, because we've averaged all of those studies as well. But we do know that on average that's a good bet. So that's one of the areas I'd always encourage teachers to look at and think about. For me, that's a good example of where the devil's in the detail. So it's all very well getting children to think generally and take responsibility generally, but with metacognition, it's about the specific match of their particular level of thinking at a particular point in time, say in problem solving in mathematics. What are the steps they need to take where they can think about planning, monitoring, or evaluating what they do? That'll be different for a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old. It'll be different in calculation from problem solving. And the teacher needs to know exactly what the focus for that metacognitive capability, what is it the children need to focus on thinking about at this point in their learning that they need more practice in doing, which over time will become automatic, will become part of their repertoire of skills. I think of it as the kind of the borderline, what's just on the surface of what you need to focus on. And that's the challenge in that area. So there's a risk register, if you like, with a toolkit. Not everything may work for you. On average, my prediction would be that if you look at the things in the toolkit that have worked on average elsewhere, in the future, they're likely to work similarly on average in other places, but they may not work for you. So making that decision about what it is that's challenging in your context and then going to research to look for solutions is a much better approach than starting at the top of the toolkit and trying to work down the ranking. You don't start at the top and work down. You start with problems and challenges in your school, and I think you use research to address those problems and challenges. There's another slightly odd way of looking at the toolkit, is that it's a whole series of answers from research to which we've removed the questions. So the toolkit gives you lots of answers, but it doesn't have the questions attached anymore. So these are all teaching and learning challenges that people have faced over the last 30, 40 years in education research. The toolkit gives you summaries, if you like, of the areas that have been most productive and what's likely to be good answers. But if you don't start with a problem or challenge, you might use the wrong answer for your context. So it's really important to engage with the local context and understand what the challenges are in order to identify an appropriate solution. Okay, I think that's my kind of background and caveats. I think we're going to move on to some questions now. Is that right, Tanya?
That's right. I've just brought them up on the screen. Thanks so much, Steve. That was fantastic just to hear you go through and really break down the uses of the toolkit and really emphasising the importance of context there within the setting. And just to let everyone, I'd just let you know, I'm a secondary teacher. So we have got primary and secondary here in the webinar. Just don't want any secondary teachers to feel like we're leaving them out tonight. But great to have us both. You're always a teacher, I think, Steve. And what I really liked about your description was that you value and really value the profession, and the teacher agency is just so important. And that's really why we're focusing on evidence-informed decision making, and based on the context and based on what is the problem for you in your context currently, and then look to the toolkit. Thank you.
Yeah. I used to worry when I first started that it was, if you like, my professional background that was biasing me towards that argument. But over the time I've spent looking at the detailed statistical background, I've realized there's a very technical reason, which I explained before, in that unless we see effect sizes of 3, teacher judgment is always going to be necessary in thinking about whether a particular finding or a particular generalization applies in context. And I think that's a message we need to communicate more broadly at policy level in terms of the limits, because there's a risk if you look at something that's worked on average, there's a danger as you introduce it as a policy that will actually reduce the effectiveness of your most effective schools. It may help schools who are struggling, but it may curtail those who are already effective. So we need to think very carefully, I think, about applying policy level prescription in schools because of that. I think we saw that in England to some extent. We'd spent a lot of time looking at the literacy and numeracy strategies, and there was really strong research-based evidence for developing an overall pedagogy. But I worry looking back that although it may have helped schools who were struggling, it may also have curtailed the skills and expertise of our best schools and teachers, who we need to still to be exploring and developing new pedagogical approaches at that cutting edge. So I'm much happier now that it's not just my teacher bias. I'm happy that there's kind of a clear statistical rationale for arguing that, although it did take me a while to work out the detail.
It's always lovely to have evidence to back up your favourite statements.
Yeah, exactly. And it always worries me slightly. It's nice when evidence contradicts what you believe and you're forced to kind of reappraise, and then you know you're really engaging. But yeah.
That's very true.
Okay, let's dive down the fractal. Effect sizes. Yes. The way we've derived effect sizes looks at annual progress on standardized tests. So we looked initially at Jean Glasser's work, where he reported back in the 80s that typical progress on standardized tests was about 1 standard deviation unit, effect size of 1 each year. So we also looked at national pupil data in England in terms of performance of 7, 11 and 14-year-olds on national test data. And although the effect size was slightly higher for younger children, it was about right for 11-year-olds. It was a bit lower at 13. We decided that 1 standard deviation unit per year was the best benchmark to use. That does differ from John's overall effect size hinge, if you like. And he's influenced by 2 things, I think. An effect size of 0.4 in terms of progress on, say, reading comprehension for 12 to 14-year-olds. It's probably not that far out. One of the challenges in education is that actually in most areas of the curriculum, children's learning progresses more rapidly at first and then flattens out over time. So if you look at reading performance, children's growth in reading from 5 to 8 is steeper in terms of the knowledge and skills that they master than it is from 8 to 12, when they're largely focusing on refining aspects of language knowledge and comprehension. So you see this general curve that's steep at the beginning and then flattens out over time. Same happens in mathematics. There's a lot that children need to learn and understand: the number system, the 4 rules, basic relationships in terms of ratio, percentage, proportion in primary school mathematics. As you move up into secondary school, the differences, if you like, the scale starts to compress. So yes, they're still making progress in reading comprehension. They might be extending their vocabulary, but proportionately, that's much less than it was when they were younger. So although older children make less progress in terms of standardized mean differences, a typical 14-year-old will probably make about 0.4 of an effect size, they're actually progressing through a flatter scale. So I'm relatively happy with using the younger age group to standardize across the whole age group. It is a slightly arbitrary decision. And I think it was important, and although I have reservations, as you're probably realizing, about that conversion to months progress, I think that scale communicates itself much more powerfully to teachers. Now, I'm not saying that if you use meta-cognition and self-regulation approaches, that every child in your class is going to get 8 months additional progress in a year. That's average across the class, across all classes who try it, across, I don't know, 10 years worth of time, if you like. So the level of precision that we can give in terms of prediction is limited. But not being able to help teachers get a handle on the relative difference is, I think, too big a cost to give up effect size and months progress. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the academic critiques of effect size with other questions. So that partly explains the difference. Of course, the other thing that explains the difference in John's work and the toolkit is he's combined, if you like, growth effect sizes and gain effect sizes in his overall comparison. So it's not surprising that his overall impact average ends up slightly different from ours. So he's looking at influences on learning, whereas we're looking at, if you like, impact effects from bringing in a new intervention. So I'm not surprised that they're different. We chose a different, if you like, benchmark as a starting point. I think John was also influenced by the hinge point, because if you average out all of the effect sizes, you get this 0.4, and then neatly you can scale that as being actually what would typically happen. So it gave him a very powerful message in visible learning. I have talked this through with him, and I understand the decisions that he made, but I made different decisions on the basis of my analysis of effect size progress. So I get why he's done it. I chose to make a slightly different approach, because we were interested in the choices that teachers make when they start something new in terms of the additional impact they can get from that. Whereas John's overall interested in all of the influences on learning and development and maturation over time. That also explains, I think, why we see differences. So self-report grades. Now, self-report grades aren't an intervention. You won't get an effect size of 1.44 if you simply tell the children to identify higher grades for their learning. What self-report grades represents is, unsurprisingly, successful learners are good at working out what they're going to get on a test or exam. That's really what that stands for. So the message we want to take, I think, from self-report grades is, when working with learners who aren't so good at predicting what they're going to get on tests, we need to improve either the realism or their self-efficacy beliefs to help them be more accurate in those predictions that they make. Now, that may or may not improve their learning outcomes. It will depend on their motivation as to whether they want to improve. It'll also depend on other strategies that they use in terms of spending more time, learning more efficiently or more effectively. So that wouldn't be an intervention for me. And the same thing would be true for collective teacher efficacy. Of course, it's important that we build teacher communities, but just building an effective teacher community on its own isn't going to have a direct effect on learning outcomes. It will only work if, as a consequence of having better collective teacher efficacy, there are changes in the teaching and learning processes in classrooms. And for me, that comes down to, are the learners going to spend more time learning? Are they going to learn more efficiently or more effectively? We need to look at learner behaviors to think about how any of these changes are going to have an impact. And if we don't see changes in what learners do in terms of the amount of time, the efficiency or effectiveness with what they engage with their learning content or topics, then why would we see any progress? I think we think too much about teacher changes in terms of learning outcomes, and we take the responsibility on ourselves. I absolutely know why we do, but unless we can see through to the logic of what's going to change in what learners do, how are they going to spend more time? How are they going to learn more efficiently or more effectively? Why would anything change in terms of outcomes? So that's really what pushes me towards interventions. To be fair, the toolkit isn't good enough at pulling apart the logic of what makes a difference. So we don't know, for example, in collaborative learning, we don't know really what the mechanism is by which that brings about improvement. There are theories from a sociocultural perspective about use of language, engaging with peers, so practicing and being introduced to ideas. I suspect that we forget that actually a successful collaborative learning task means that 2, 3, 4 learners are just working more efficiently on a task because they keep each other engaged. And we may be missing simply the amount of time they spend productively learning in the lesson. They may moderate so that that's at a more effective level. They may help and scaffold each other's learning, so that's better than the individual learner can do on their own. But I think it has to be something to do with just the amount of time they spend effectively engaged. And if we don't see that, then we create another explanation for why collaborative learning works. So picking apart the logic of what actually is happening from the learner's point of view is, I think, absolutely essential. Okay, should we move on to the more technical stuff and critiques of the toolkit? Oh, no, sorry, there's I've forgotten this. Yeah. How do you use the toolkit if you're a relief teacher? I think that's a really interesting question.
Great.
Because what lies behind it is a really good analysis of the implication that actually lots of these strategies take time to build up. You need to work with a class over time, and your effectiveness depends on the choices, or if you like, the orchestration of using different strategies. I think of teaching and learning as it's a bit like learning to be an expert chef or cook. The toolkit gives you specific recipes, if you like, and you can practice and learn to do those particular pedagogies. So you can learn how to do peer tutoring, or you can learn how to do aspects of collaborative learning, or you can think about engaging parents. But what the expert teacher does is they learn when a particular technique is useful for a particular class. And that's obviously much harder in a relief teaching context where you may see a class only once or infrequently over time. So I think there you've got to look at what are the tools and techniques that you can break down into shorter periods of time. So metacognition and self-regulation, obviously you're looking to build up over time sort of automation and fluency that becomes embedded, and then you move on to the next thing that's problematic and you embed that. As someone coming into a class for a short space of time, it's hard to work out the right level for that. But there are strategies I think you can do around encouraging learners to plan or monitor or review. You wouldn't want to do all of them every lesson. You've got to choose what you think is most appropriate based on either your knowledge of the school or the context. Then there are other strategies like collaborative learning. So, okay, you almost certainly wouldn't want to risk using one of Kagan's more complex collaborative learning strategies the first time you work with a class. But you can almost certainly do something like think, pair, share, or think, ink, pair, share. which is a relatively simple strategy, which again might have the benefit of keeping learners engaged and thinking about other perspectives in those short bursts. So I absolutely understand that you are limited in terms of what you can do when you come in for a short period of time, but I don't think that means that, that you can't use the toolkit. And if you look at something like feedback, feedback is about the quality of the response you give to the learner at a particular point in time. Now, yes, of course, that gets easier the more you know the learners. You know whether or not actually they don't need much feedback, they need some encouragement, or it may be they simply need something pointed out that they hadn't noticed. That might be sufficient feedback. But thinking about that and concentrating on that when you're working with a new class to work out, I think about it as judging the nudge. What's the particular nudge a class, a group, or an individual need that you can give? I personally think the evidence supports what you might think of as live or online feedback in the teaching context. I think all of the evidence, particularly for younger learners, but even at secondary level too, suggests that learners find it very hard to engage with delayed or written feedback. And part of what we're actually trying to do when we work with older learners is get them to be able to use feedback in a more sophisticated way. So that might be through marking or by delaying the period of time. But for most learners, immediate verbal feedback is almost always the most effective. The challenge is working out, as I say, what's the nudge you can give them? Because it is just a nudge. Is it about the content? Is it about the process? Is it about the outcome? Is it about the motivation? Is it more general feedback about something that you're impressed or surprised by? Because sometimes just acknowledging surprise can be a really powerful piece of feedback to a learner, because it almost is showing that you've underestimated what they're capable of and they've impressed you. Well, that in itself is a really, really powerful message. We could do a whole other session on feedback, Tanya.
I got very excited in that discussion. I was thinking we should do feedback. That's great, Steve. That has...
Yeah, it's absolutely
right. Now you've signed yourself up, Steve. It's live and it's recorded here. You've just said you're up for feedback, so we'll have you back. That would be fantastic. We'll move forward to the next slide, and I just want to thank all the people that wrote in and asked these fantastic questions, especially that one there. I really appreciated the contextualization within the email that was provided and just the honesty. So thank you all for being so honest tonight and sending in these questions. And
just
here
before
we get very technical.
Yeah, just before we move on, I'm just going to respond to George Lilly, who has commented that John's aim is quite clear in terms of VL was to find out what works best. That actually, you put your finger on where John and I start to diverge, because I think he's quite careful now to describe visible learning as influences on student learning, whereas the toolkit looks at interventions or changes to approaches which produce impact. And there's clearly some overlap between the two, and you certainly see feedback, for example, high on both. But if that was John's aim, then he hasn't quite done that by including maturational effects, by looking at gender, by looking at growth over time and correlational effect sizes and homework. So I think he's been quite careful recently to talk about influences on student learning, because all effect size does is it puts the difference between two groups on a common scale. That's what effect size is trying to do. It's just trying to look at difference either over time for a single group or between groups. So it's quantifying that difference. It was a response, if you like, to the statistical world's use of hypothesis testing and p-values, because all that tells you is there a difference that we might conceptualize as being real? I suppose another way of informally describing that would be, is it greater than you'd expect by chance? The statistical background is a bit complex. I've talked about that in an article if anyone's interested. I'm interested not in whether that difference is real. I'm interested in how big the difference is, and John is as well. And that's what he pioneered. working with Herbert Wahlberg back in the 80s, this notion of actually we're not interested in whether we think it's a real difference. What we're interested in education is how big is the difference. And that's the central, if you like, approach of both both visible learning and the toolkit. I'm just going to encourage George to email me. We should probably carry on that correspondence in private. Yeah, I share similar concerns, but we'll move on to the next question.
Right, thank you.
Technical queries. Yeah, Adrian Simpson's actually a colleague of mine at Durham. I've written with him, actually wrote a book review of visible learning with him a few years ago. I think what Adrian's work points out is that effect size may or may not be comparable. And that's the question, I think, because we know that effect size varies with age, for example. And there's just a simple technical reason for that. As children get older, the spread increases. So if you think of the spread of reading capability of 5-year-olds, it's relatively narrow. They've only been alive for 5 years. They probably haven't been learning how to read for that long. So the spread is quite small. By the time you get to age 14, the spread of capability for readers is huge. And effect size is the difference divided by that spread. So not surprisingly, as children get older and as the spread increases, effect sizes tend to reduce. As I mentioned before, I'm less worried about that because I think progress in subjects also decreases. So it's not quite as incomparable as someone like Adrian argues. My worry about the critique is that I'd be happy to give up effect sizes if we could come up with something better. Their strength and their weakness is they put everything on a single scale. They're a ratio, effectively, of gain to spread. And the assumption is, in both visible learning and in the toolkit, that there's sufficient data across a large number of studies that is effectively positive signal that we've identified what's an underlying real difference. If Adrian's right, it's all just research-based noise, research and measurement noise. Now, personally, I think that's unlikely. And actually, the project I've started now to effectively unzip the toolkits and compare effect sizes from single studies more directly will eventually tell us. But I think that there's more noise, there's more a signal in education research. Adrian thinks there's more noise. I think that's an empirical question, and I'm going to try and find out. Dylan William worries about context. That's why I emphasize that it's not about identifying something that works universally. It's about identifying good bets that will help inform decision making. Because Dylan's quite right, it's a similar critique of policy level implementation of research-based evidence. It's unlikely you're ever going to find something that all schools should do and stop doing what they were doing before. There's always going to be marginal gains for your best schools and higher gains for your struggling schools. So actually at a recent conference at Durham, Dylan also agreed that there's nothing better than month's progress, because again, month's progress has come under criticism. We could convert it to percentiles, percentages. You could convert it back into the original scales. But he argues, like me, that actually the month's progress is probably the most interpretable until we can come up with a better measure. Terry Wrigley's argument is a bit different, I think, and I disagree with him quite profoundly, because I think it's important that teachers know and use evidence in their professional work, even with those limitations. Because if teachers don't, policymakers will. And given my reservations about how effective evidence can be at that general policy level, I think it's essential that teachers engage with the evidence to support the decision-making in their local context. I don't think we're trying to impose a technology of teaching at all. I think we're trying to encourage better bets based on evidence. So we learn from previous generations, we learn from the patterns that there are existing in the research, rather than having to find everything out for ourselves from scratch, each generation of teachers. Yes, we pass on information through the culture of teaching. My worry there is that sometimes we get it wrong. So we all suffer from normal human biases. Children progress over the course of the year. We sometimes unreasonably ascribe the improvement to something we've done when actually they probably would have got better anyway. Or we notice that, say, boys are more motivated technology because we're looking for that. We don't notice that actually the girls are just a bit quieter and equally motivated. And that confirms our hypothesis that technology particularly motivates boys. If you look at the evidence, I don't think that's true. I think it motivates all children fairly equally. But if you're predisposed to believe it helps boys, then you'll see evidence that it helps boys. So that's why I think we need to use research evidence. We need just occasionally, I think of them as surveying pegs. We need to hammer a surveying peg into the ground and actually measure the distance. We need to precisely work out what sort of improvements there. Can't do that all the time, and it wouldn't be desirable to do it all the time. But we have to think about just occasionally testing our assumptions and assertions about what works, and that evidence is an important part of that. And sometimes it brings us up short. So if you look at something like learning styles, very controversial, very popular, 10, 15 years ago. Overall, the evidence, and to be fair, we've known this since the 1930s, we keep rediscovering the same patterns, that targeting particular children with particular activities is not beneficial to their overall learning. I get criticism now because learning styles are still in the toolkits, and that it shouldn't be there because people argue it's not a robust or reliable scientific concept. That's true, but teachers find it appealing, and I think we can unpick why they find it appealing. What are learning styles trying to do? They're trying to, I suppose, personalize aspects of learning, simplify the complexity. Think about the range of diverse learners that you've got in front of you, and then find some way to help them as different learners rather than treating them as a homogeneous group. The other thing I think is more subtle in terms of learning styles. I think you're also giving learners choices in saying, I'm not sure how you learn best. I think it might be this way. Here are a range of ways that you might tackle this task. Which do you think will suit you best? And there's a subtle sleight of hand in that, where you're transferring responsibility to the learner, because they decide they're going to do it best this way, and boy, are they going to prove that they are going to do it best that way. So that shift of responsibility is probably what drove teachers' belief in why learning styles were effective. I think we can see that actually that's really more about self-regulation. It's about negotiating with learners to increase the responsibility they take for planning, monitoring, reviewing, or managing their persistence, their resilience. That's actually the productive space. And we were a bit seduced by the labels and the ease with which we could simply divide classes into 3 groups of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners and plan activities accordingly. There was also another subtle difference, wasn't there? When teachers did that, they thought about 3 different ways to teach a particular objective. Now, actually, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic might not actually have been the 3 best ways. It might be 3 visual ways or 3 auditory ways to explain a particular concept or idea. But in doing that work, to find different ways of communicating the same ideas, I think we probably improved our teaching practice. So although the label is almost certainly scientifically incorrect, the space in which teachers were working was almost certainly productive. I think we can do better. I think we can identify those areas over time that are likely to be more productive. Feedback, self-regulation, clearly are the 2 areas that would correspond in the toolkit. So I think that's really quite important to make sure we start to improve, if you like, the precision with which we talk about teaching and learning, but also that's a professional responsibility. Okay, I'll go back down the fractal a little bit. Of course, different tests give different effect sizes. So a vocabulary test, if you're simply teaching new words to children, they're likely to score a lot higher than if you're looking at a reading comprehension test. So effect sizes in vocabulary interventions tend to be higher than they are in comprehension interventions. But overall, the scale still works, is my observation. So there is variation, yes. But the work we've done on looking at the relative difference, so in a vocabulary test, you'll also probably get greater spread, so that will moderate it slightly. But it's certainly true that the more complex the outcome in education, the harder it is to achieve, and therefore the lower the effect size is likely to be. Well, actually, that's quite important to know. That's a useful piece of information, that it's harder to teach comprehension than teaching vocabulary. And of course, our goals in education are complex. Sometimes we might be interested in mastering vocabulary. In the long run, we're interested in understanding, and that's harder to achieve. Standard deviations, yeah, okay. We're now right down the fractal. I'm probably people are probably starting to tune out at this point. If you're interested, we've done some papers where we've looked at this. So when we started to work with the EF on their trials, this issue about which standard deviation do you use was niggling in the back of my mind from meta-analyses. So you can use the standard deviation of the control group, the intervention group, or combined. We've looked at that systematically, and actually once your sample size is of above about 30 and certainly above 50, then which standard deviation you use makes almost no difference at all, unless an intervention has a really profound effect on your intervention group, and it isn't the same for all learners. So if an intervention works really well for some and really badly for others, it will increase the spread of that group. And then you need to be careful about using the combined standard deviation. But typically, when we've looked at this, we looked at 50 EEF research studies. The difference between Glasser's delta, Hedges G, Cohen's D was negligible, much less than the other choices that the analysts made in undertaking that. If anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to send you the paper. If nothing else, it'll probably be a good cure for insomnia if you're having trouble sleeping.
Seems unlikely, Steve. I don't understand the world that would cure insomnia for me.
Well, try the paper.
All right, I'll try, and then I'll get back to you.
Yeah, the final one about this is the classic issue about apples and oranges. I still like Jean Glasser's response. Yes, there are certainly times when we're comparing apples, oranges, pears, strawberries. But so long as they're all fruit and you can make meaningful inferences about fruit, then it's fair enough to compare them. So, let's unpack that metaphor a bit. If you're looking at oranges and apples, then there are obviously things about citrus fruits and apples that are different, that it wouldn't be reasonable to draw conclusions about. So things to do with the thickness of the skin, the segmentation. You could compare citrus fruit if you're making that inference, but it wouldn't be reasonable to stick an apple in that bunch. So my observation is always that it depends on the overall question that you're asking. And in the toolkit, we're thinking about the relative benefits of different approaches. So we do want to use that hover over level. Sorry, George, definitely Jean Glass. I can give you the reference. Provided we think, okay, it's almost like hovering up. So if you're looking within collaborative learning, you could do some very precise analyses about the length of the intervention, the particular approach, the number of children involved, the amount of training. You can answer some very specific questions. When you look at the relative difference of collaborative learning, say from peer tutoring, which is actually one form of collaborative learning, then you're making kind of other inferences. The toolkit's trying to make inferences about cost benefit. Where is it worth schools putting their time and energy? So I think it's legitimate to combine effect sizes from different kinds of studies and different kinds of subjects, because we're looking for the relative benefit. Now, absolutely, an improvement of an effect size of 0.4 in reading will not have exactly the same educational outcomes of an improvement of 0.4 in mathematics. In the long run, there will be differences. But if you're taking that as a proxy at a particular point in time for educational growth, and you don't always use the same measure, you take different snapshots, if you like, of educational growth, then I think it's meaningful to compare everything on a single scale of educational growth. And we take those as little snapshots or proxies. Now that has dangers. So actually, when thinking about the early years toolkit, if you look at letter knowledge in early years, we know that historically, letter knowledge age 3, 4, 5 strongly predicts reading capability at age 11. The mistake we made was then assuming that if we taught more letter knowledge and letter knowledge only to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, that they'd be better readers at 11. It worked as a proxy because it stood for wider language knowledge and experience. It was a good enough measure as a predictor. If we then try and teach that to hothouse a particular subset of skills, that may not lead to the growth we're expecting to see age 11, because there were a whole host of other things in language. And you see that particularly in the US, I think, the fade out of early literacy studies, the decline that you get, unless that's built on, unless the early benefit that you get is built on, then you'll see a decline. Okay, it looks like we're starting to run out of time. Apologies, I'm a minute over.
No, it was a delightful minute over.
One last comment. I'd encourage George to get in touch. Please do email me.
Yeah, no, please do. And we'll send out to Steve, if you want to send us all the materials that you have related to this, we'll send it out in the follow-up email from the webinar as well. For me, this has been an absolutely delightful webinar, just to hear you delve into such depths about both the technical and then I think the really practical aspects about how teachers can use the toolkit, and that, you know, really the way that you value the profession and give the agency to them was really fantastic to hear. So thank you, Steve, and thank you for your time.